Hello there, everyone. I hope you're all keeping well and welcome and thank you for joining me at this GHOULS Magazine panel. Tonight, we will be talking about a subject that is close to my heart and is something that I've really wanted to talk about in more depth with people in the community for some time now. And we're going to be discussing working class representation in horror. So, class is one of society's greatest taboos, whilst also being an undeniably influential factor in how we live, work, how we view ourselves, how we view other people, and of course, the opportunities that we have access to. But in the world of horror, criticism, portrayals, and interpretations of and from the working class can often be pushed to the sidelines and overlooked. But tonight, I want to create a platform for further discourse to reflect on the position of the working class in the genre and open out the conversation about how we arrive at class related readings of horror that are both accessible and authentic. And of course, I can only do this with the help of others, which is why I am thrilled to be joined by my incredible lineup of guests who are here with me today. Thank you so much to all of you. And I want to begin by inviting you all to tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do. And so, Caitlyn, you're first on my screen, so I'm going to start with you.
Okay, great. Hello, my name is Caitlyn. I write for GHOULS Magazine and also run my own blog over at scaredsheepless.com.
Lovely. And that is a super duper blog. I recommend anyone to check that out. And Kat, you're next. What about you?
Yeah, so my name is Kat Hughes. I'm a freelance film critic with bylines with Ghouls, thehollywoodnews.com, Film Stories, and Film Hounds. And you can also find me on a plethora of podcasts talking about all things horror.
We love a plethora of podcasts.
Yes, we do.
I think Mal might be just setting up. Mal, can you hear me? No, maybe not. Belle, let's go to you then.
Perfect. Hi there. Yeah, so I'm Belle, or also Mix Belle. Morrigan would be my full performer name. I've kind of got fingers in many pies. I'm the creator, host behind Fishnets and Philosophy, which is a website, and then also a podcast where I kind of talk genre, cinema, and just wider societal fun issues. And yeah, I also write for Ghouls and just performer as well, burlesque and pole dance. So yeah, that's me.
And last but certainly not least, Mike, what about you?
Hello, I'm Michael Fausti, director, actor, and writer, and horror and art horror fan.
Lovely. I think we're just having a bit of an issue getting Mal to join us, but hopefully they can pop along in a moment. So let's get the discussion off the ground then. I wanted to open out by asking a bit more broadly about the issue of class as a whole in horror. From your perspective then, how do you think that class is being represented within horror at the moment? And do you think that we're seeing enough discourse around this subject? And Kat, I'm going to throw that one to you.
I think that class is definitely something that's coming back. There's a lot of eat the riches sort of stories that are popular at the moment. There was Triangle of Sadness, The Menu, even Infinity Pool's got quite a healthy dose of it. So I think it's something that is still prevalent, but I don't necessarily think it's pushing as hard as it could, especially on the angle of positive representation for the working class. I think the only one that I can sort of think of recently is maybe Hounded, which is the rich. They're not allowed to fox hunt anymore, so they decided to start hunting chavs, and they're basically entrapping working class criminals so that they can go on a hunt, which is obviously deplorable, but the film does a really good job at humanizing the sort of hoodie characters which are so often vilified in class films.
Yeah, there seem to be a lot of films that are really, it's that oppositional, it's like the us and them position, isn't it? But yeah, I think it's about how those characters are portrayed and where the empathy is put and what the intention is behind it. So Belle, I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, so I was thinking on this one, and I kind of like, picking up on the same thread as Kat there, that we are seeing a lot of these kind of eat the rich thematic films at the moment. It seems to be quite popular, particularly, I think, after globally, the world has been so kind of politically divided, and then also in a quote unquote post-COVID world, because it's not really post, it's still there, but in a post-COVID world, seeing which class of people benefited from what happened and which didn't. So I think there is a kind of an anger bubbling up against those who are in an elite position. So that's where I think these films are coming from. But I kind of feel like the films are kind of just in this weird type of vacuum where they're not actually saying anything about class. It's like a punching up at rich people, as in, oh, those wealthy elites are awful, aren't they? Let's laugh at them and see them have terrible things happen to them. But there's no actual commentary on the working class, on class itself. It's more of just a pantomime villain type thing. So it's kind of like things are being portrayed, but nothing's being said. That's kind of what I'm thinking anyway.
I couldn't agree more. And Mike, I can see you nodding along there. I think there's going to be a lot of nods tonight. What are your thoughts on this question of how class is being represented in 2023 in horror?
Yeah, I totally agree with what Belle said, actually. I mean, ultimately, I don't think there's any kind of sort of nuanced portrayals going on. I think it's kind of being done, but it's not being done with any sort of degree of sophistication of any of the classes, really. If they do venture into the kind of sort of arena of sort of class war, then it's not really done with any sort of great subtlety. And the risk of sounding like a student who hasn't done his homework, I'm in the middle of actually editing at the moment one of my own films, and one of my kind of disciplines when I'm editing is I don't actually look particularly at anything kind of new or contemporary because it might influence me. So really a lot of my sort of reference points tonight are going to be from sort of like older movies. I've got a whole list of films that I want to see and I just haven't seen yet. So my sort of contributions are going to be fairly retro. Particularly in regards to the sort of hoodie horror and that of the sort of 2000s, I'll be able to contribute to that. But my knowledge certainly of the last kind of sort of year or so, during COVID, as Belle mentioned, I was able to watch quite a lot. But as I say, in the last kind of year or so, when I've been fairly sort of like engrossed in an edit, I've not really been able to.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point you make there about the both you and Bella are discussing there about the lack of messaging, and I wonder how much of that is around, like, what's the reasoning behind that? Is it fear? Is it not wanting to be provocative? Is it wanting to please all audiences? The question that lies underneath that is something that interests me. I don't know if Caitlyn, have you got any thoughts on this issue before we move on?
Yeah, I think I tend to agree with what's been said already, really, in terms of there isn't that much representation, but I'd argue it kind of exists, but it intersects with other identities. So you might have a film that's quite focused on gender, for example, and there is an underlying thing of class within it, thinking of a film like The Babadook, but the primary theme is not class. So there's a lot of these things that it kind of runs underway, but as you say, there's not any digging into what actually that means. There's always a more dominant concern to be dealt with first. I think that's the main thing I find.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So issues of class might be being explored, but they're like certainly not up front and center, and they're not, I guess they're not clarified either.
Yeah, I think they sort of become a facet of a character, but without really delving into what that means for that character.
Yeah. And Mal, I just want to check, can you hear us now?
Yep, I'm all right now. I'm not sure what happened earlier, but I think just froze for a minute.
Fabulous. Do you want to just quickly introduce yourself so people know who you are and tell us briefly what you do?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Mal. I generally just watch a lot of films, go to a lot of film festivals. I've been a horror fan for forever. Did the old apprenticeship working as in an old video shop. So that's where my love of movies and horror started. And now, yeah, I'm just an average Joe. I'm not a writer like some people or a filmmaker like people on the call. I'm just go to the films. I'm a big fan, but I advocate and I promote where possible, especially independent films and that sort of thing as well.
Yeah, I guess on that point then, I was literally just going to come to that, the idea of independent films and whether in those spaces, does anyone have any commentary on perhaps is that a space where there is more of a representation of the working class going on? Is that a space that, I don't know, maybe Mike, you could talk to that as a filmmaker?
I don't think particularly there is any sort of, wishing to go, sort of following off what we already said, wishing to kind of delve into that area really. I mean, I guess this always comes up with any question about representation. It's whilst the means of production has been democratized in terms of sort of, film production, the same can be said of music and podcasting and stuff like that. Sort of fellow indie filmmakers, we talk about this idea of being stuck in this fishbowl in which, whilst we've made our movies, actually getting beyond our sort of, our immediate circle and getting people to actually watch this stuff, still remains impossible. Even movies which are being spoken about as low budget, I've got budgets of 100,000 or what have you. This really isn't kind of, a working class person's game in terms of, being able to get hold of those kind of resources. Mm-hmm. And, particularly growing up, there weren't many sort of, immediately obvious filmmakers out there who kind of, came from a background similar to mine or sounded like me, other than Alan Parker. And basically everybody just, it was an aspiration that was kind of sort of not really seen as something that working class people do. And, unless you had an uncle already working at the BBC or something like that, this wasn't really something that, working class people go into. And, I was having a discussion with my partner and producer, Lou Nosbot, about this. And I think part of this is also to do with the kind of confidence that comes from, sort of those cushions like wealth and going to certain schools and already having those connections before you even start. But as I say, I think sort of technology has democratized this process, but at the same time, there is still just so far that you can get as a working class filmmaker. So I don't think that's why we are particularly seeing this area kind of, explored in any great way in horror, because I think those who are still kind of being able to get through are, upper middle class writers, filmmakers, and therefore, they are the ones controlling the representation. And therefore, we are sort of seeing the kind of representations which still do fall back on, cliched representations of working class people like Wayne and Wynette as slob or sort of like, feral animals.
Yeah. It's a really interesting point you make about that starting position. And I guess you've also mentioned they're not just filmmakers, but writers as well. And I wanted to sort of mention that I guess when we talk about a working class perspective, it's important that we acknowledge that that's not just about what we see on screens. It's about how that's reflected in the creation of films, in who's telling those stories, where they're coming from. And I guess this idea of, hearing from the community at large, whether that's through podcasting or through written work as well. And I wondered, do we think that we're seeing enough of that even? And how far do we think things have come in terms of ensuring that those perspectives are heard? And Kat, I'll invite you to give your thoughts on that.
I think podcasting, especially with the pandemic, I think that has opened up a whole new world of voices, because anybody with a microphone and a computer can get their voice out there. I think the podcasting community has been really good at embracing that. But in terms of writing and the industry as a whole, it's still gatekept. It's still too expensive. Most industry type jobs, even writing for certain establishments, like well-known writing outlets, the pay is entry-level pay is next to nothing, or internship, it's free. You know, I used to work for a couple of film distributors, and the runners there pretty much got their lunch covered, and that was it. And they were working like 50-hour weeks, but it was it's your foot in the door, it's a foot in the industry. And it's something that only people who have that family money to fall back on can afford to do. I mean, I myself would never have been able to do that. I'm from a single parent family. I did a media production degree at university, and then I left my degree and went into retail because I couldn't afford to go and not get paid to work. And even making films at university, it was down to us as students to finance our own short films in our final year. We got to borrow equipment from the uni, but anything else was all ours. And I was the only working class person within my particular group. And it was always kind of difficult because they were like, oh, let's go and film in Spain. Let's go and do this. And like, my dad can give us this. And I've got this piece of kit. I mean, the director of my group, his dad was something to do with Panorama, and his mum used to be one of the directors of BBC Manchester. So he was very, very much a completely different class of person to me in terms of his experience and wealth. And it was a real struggle. And I don't think that has changed at all as we've moved forwards.
Yeah, and Mal, what about you? What are your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because obviously I'm not like I said, I'm not a filmmaker and I'm not a critic and such. But when I look at people that I know or people that have done worked in this environment, you know, there's so many more working class voices being heard, because I think there's an avenue now where before, like Kat just said, you had to know somebody or you had to be in the right connections to even, you know, get somewhere or, you know, be heard. Whereas now, you know, with the social media, with the internet and everything else being available, and people can really get their voices heard. But also with filmmaking, I think there's a different narrative now where if you are an independent filmmaker, you can start telling your story, especially if you're working class, and say, look, well, this is representation we want to see. And the opportunities now do present themselves. Obviously, you know, again, like Mike said, budgets are what they are, and you'll say you do what you can. But I think there's more of a chance now to go against the grain. Whereas before, whenever you saw a horror film, the working class person was either the person doing, you know, the bad things, or the person that you probably wouldn't trust in that movie, or the person that really, you know, you sort of think, oh, I'm not sure what's going on here. They've got a certain accent or they come from a certain background. Dodgy. I'd rather look at a person who's got a lot of money as the guiding light in that movie. Do you know what I mean? So I think now there's the opportunity to flip that completely.
Yeah, I feel like although technology can be a bad thing, in this case, it's actually, as we've all said, it's sort of opened up this democratic space. But I guess there's still a lot of issues there. And Belle, I know you're somebody that works across a lot of different industries. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, with this question, it was like something that I was like dwelling on it for a little bit, because I do think, as Mal was saying there, it is true that, as everyone's touched on, that because of technology, more people can kind of get their voices out there in different ways. But there are still those barriers to the industry, in the sense that it's still the case that, you know, unless you come from a position of privilege and you have like familial wealth, you know, you can't do your creative thing full time. Like, as in a lot of these things, you can't make a living off it. And I think actually this question that you're asking is actually very pertinent right now, given that it was only, I think, today that, you know, the Writers Guild of America announced their strike. You know, I think that's something, you know, that's very, like, you know, that's workers banding together to demand fair pay for the work that they do. You know, and I think that's something that's important to see, and I hope that it goes the way that they deserve it to. But I think it comes back to, like, you know, can people only kind of strike because they have the means to be able to do it? And there's like all these different kind of questions that you kind of have to ask, and it's really tricky. Like, you know, for myself, like, you know, I do, like, you know, my podcasting, and I have a few other different creative outlets, but I can't do them full time. I can only dedicate, you know, I have to work in order to live, and then whatever free time I have is what I can dedicate towards it. and it's tricky. And I think it is still in some ways an old men's club, and who has access is still something that I think is very true, and it's frustrating, but I do think it's possible for more voices to be heard. It's just, the people that are in positions of privilege have to, extend that hand out and help them up. Like, people can't just get in without that help, unfortunately.
Yeah, you make really good points about like privilege and access. Well, before we move on, Caitlyn, I just wanted to invite you if you've got anything further to add.
Yeah, I think definitely on Belle's point as well, of if you have a 9 to 5, you've only got so much capacity for after your 9 to 5 job to come in and do even more writing and things like that. It's incredibly difficult. As well, I think your location pays into it a lot, because I'm in Wales, very little access to press screenings, things like that. They tend to be in London in the daytime, which is, again, it takes out that sort of those people who are doing it part-time, who would perhaps like to do it full-time, but to be able to get those views, you need to be there with the most current releases. It makes sense. It's what people want to see, what they want to read about. In terms of filmmakers, those films made with lower levels of technology, they're going to look different, and they're going to look a way that perhaps a mainstream audience is not used to seeing quite as much. And again, as Mike said, it's about getting it out there. It's about getting it to critics, about getting it to distributors. That's the kind of thing that costs that extra money, that even if you make the film, getting it out there and getting it to be received by the people who need to receive it is quite difficult, because it may not match people's kind of glossy expectations of a film.
Yeah. So deep breaths now, everybody. I know I've been seeing a few of you tweeting about rewatching Eden Lake. Apologies. One of the most well-known touchstones, and certainly when we were promoting this panel, this is what people seem to be keen to hear about, was what is known as hoodie horror, and within that category sit films like Eden Lake. So I wanted to invite people to give thoughts on these films and how humanizing or demonizing such portrayals are of working class communities. And Belle, we have recently had a very cathartic, I called it, I think, discussion on your podcast, Fishnets and Philosophy, about this film. So I wanted to kick off with you, and please share your thoughts on this.
Yeah, for anyone who is interested, that episode that with yourself and Alice from the Drunken Horror podcast, that's due to release on my main feed tomorrow for Fishnets and Philosophy. So yeah, keep an ear out for that. But yeah, with Eden Lake, I do have a lot of thoughts, and I also have an upcoming Ghouls written piece on it as well, because there's just so many thoughts. But I think the main kind of, I guess, takeaway, to kind of bring it down to a bite-sized comment for something that you could have so many threads on, but my main takeaway is kind of a lot of those films from that era, so Eden Lake and any of the other films like Eels, or Them, the French film as well, like a lot of these films, like, to me, I think they kind of take place like without any context given as to why the people in these communities might have a lot of anger and rage towards, a society and a world that just is constantly putting them down. These films don't give any of that context. There's no commentary on the fact that so many of these communities are disenfranchised and lack resources and just lack any type of support. That, when in these films, it just shows this is violence for violence sake. These are just villainous people who are just villainous. They are animalistic. They have no control. And it portrays it as being a reflection on working class communities and those people. And without having that nuanced conversation and giving that context, it's just, you know, it's just pure bias and fear, which is constantly also stoked by the actions of an elitist media as well. Like, you know, it all feeds into each other, and it's, you know, it's frustrating. I think it's, to me, like, you know, to put it bluntly, I kind of think it is kind of just lazy filmmaking to just lean on those stereotypes.
Yeah. And Mal, what about you?
Yeah, so Eden Lake's another one where very much what Belle said, you know, it comes across as just, oh, here's a bunch of hoodies and chavs, we're going to just demonize them, and they're going to be the ones that are taking this film to where it's going to go. But I think the other thing to add to that is that politically, when that film came out, it was around the sort of time of, you know, Tony Blair's government really pushing down on antisocial behavior, all the ASBOs, that sort of stuff. So it almost became an alarm bell to say, look, you know, this is something we can almost get behind, to say, this is what hoodies do, this is what chavs do, this is what, you know, all those terminology that was used to demonize them. And then that allowed that young, misrepresented person to be portrayed in a certain way. And it became rich versus poor. It became these kids who were marked as feral, almost not doing much. Probably, you know, you saw the homes in the film as well, you know, the way they were depicted. And then suddenly it became like, it's poor versus rich, and the poor people are the ones that are a problem, and the rich people just want to have, you know, just want to enjoy. He's got this diamond ring he wants to propose to, and just let them get on with their lives, kind of thing. And I think that plays up to that stereotype. So I think that period of when those films came out, a lot of the hoodie films, for want of a better terminology, linked back to the political stance of Britain at that time, and I think it didn't do any favors. Eden Lake, I think what it does do, the way it even ends, and no spoilers for those, I'm sure everyone's seen it here, but the way it even ends, it's almost like, oh well, that's what they do. They look after themselves, look after their own, and we know we're separated from this. That's we don't get involved in that sort of thing. We will do the better. We will do the right thing, as it were. And I think that really plays well on underlining Belle's point there.
Yeah, and on Belle's podcast, we talked a lot about how there's always a need for othering in society to assert control from the elite and from the media and the establishment and those in power. And I think my big question mark over Eden Lake is really about, as you've said, Mal, it's that specifically that period of time, and we had the respect agenda and everything else going on, and whether the morality of using something like that as a bedrock for entertainment, and just morally where that leaves us. But Kat, I know you've recently rewatched the film as well. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, the director is from Nottingham and Jack O'Connell's from Derby, and I am from the boundary of Nottingham and Derby. So I've always found this film a little confronting, from the respect of, I recognize those characters. I hung out with characters like teens like that, not quite that aggressive and like murdering people or anything. I should make that known, but I know these people. I grew up around council estates and those sorts of families that the parents did let the kids go out and they didn't know what they were doing and they'd be off having a party and stuff. But that is one subset of a small minority of the working class. And then this film just is like, no, this is what they're all like. Everybody in this village, they're all poor, they're all doing this. And it doesn't address the behavior of the couple, because on a rewatch they are kind of to blame. You know, okay, they're trying to have like a nice quiet time at the beach, but the beach is behind, well, the quarry, it's behind, gates. It's, it's like they are trespassing themselves. But we're supposed to view it as, oh, but they just want a nice time. Wait, they are trespassing themselves. They then, take it upon themselves to break into one of the teens' houses, and I really struggle to connect to them from that point of view, because these kids are there, they're there having a party and stuff, and for the most part they're ignoring the couple initially, and it's only when the couple go over and they're like, oh, but my quiet time isn't quiet anymore in this abandoned quarry that we're not supposed to be in. How dare you? Because there's growing up in Nottingham and Derby, there aren't facilities for the youth. We were left to roam in parks and woods and actually there was a quarry that me and my friends used to go to as well. So it felt very close to home for me, and it's just so frustrating because as somebody that grew up around those people, I saw those types of people, but I myself wasn't part of that, and it's so frustrating to be just lumped in. When I say, oh, I'm from Nottingham, around that time especially, it's like, oh, Shottingham, that's how it became colloquially known around the country, was as Shottingham. And it's, I think for the people in the community watching it who don't recognize themselves in it, it's really hard to then get above the stigma of this film. Rant over.
No, it's great to hear from you. And I think you raised a good point about entitlement. And I think there's a lot of entitlement in that film on behalf of the couple. And for me, what's so problematic is that all those empathetic moments are given to them, and we don't ever get those empathetic moments for the working class characters. Caitlyn, do you have any thoughts that you want to share?
Yeah, I was really glad that Kat brought up how awful the central couple are, because as you say, I think Eden Lake is very much a product of its time in that it was part of a national conversation. It was sort of drawing attention, and horror's kind of always done that. Any kind of moral panic, it'll pick up on and run with. So I think it makes sense from that context. But I think definitely on rewatch, you just look at them and you go, well, they are the problem. Justice for Bonnie, for one. And I just think even that kind of thing, that you've got, dogs named Bonnie and Clyde, it's such a like the only thing this working class community have is like an aspiration to violence, and a glorification of violence, and it's simply not part of that. But I think it's still a grueling film, and it's enjoyable from that kind of viewpoint. But I think when you watch it now, you are just left with how terrible they are. And I'd be interested to see if anyone's coming at it today and seeing, for the first time and seeing it that way. Because certainly the first time you watch it, it's with all the background noise that comes with it.
And Mike, you mentioned that, your references are more steeped in the past, shall we say. So I wonder, in terms of when you're looking for references or just doing research, is there anything historically in terms of working class representation in horror that you've picked up on that you'd like to share?
I was thinking about a film actually I've not seen in a long while. It was by Wes Craven, who I watched Scream a while back, and I was always struck by how big the houses are in Scream. And it's that kind of idea, I guess, that they're sort of upper middle class, so therefore it's fine. But he did a film called The People Under the Stairs many years ago, which, whilst it's got some sort of problematic representations around ethnicity and sort of criminality is sort of associated, particularly with African Americans. What you have there, I think, is one of the few examples of where we see an upper middle class couple, no spoilers, who are just pure monsters. And the fact that their characters are mummy and daddy, I think really is, a kind of sort of perversion of that, conservative nuclear family that is always put forward as the ideal. And, eventually there is justice in a form in that I think that there is some wealth distribution at the end of that movie, if memory serves me right. I think the house gets blown up and we see all this wealth that they've been hoarding suddenly dispersed into the community. And I think that that's probably one of the more sort of bolder examples of kind of, it's not really a positive representation, but a representation that does look to kind of sort of challenge some of these kind of, fairly sort of common tropes. And, we did see a lot of these kind of, these chav movies, which, were just awful. And Owen Jones has written sort of fairly extensively about Eden Lake and a lot of this kind of thing. I mean, really, one of the things I was going to say about Eden Lake is that the beginning of that film, I always forget, because it starts in London and she's this infant school teacher, and she's with these lovely kids, and then they kind of get out of London, and it's kind of like, oh my God, where are we? So I think there's also this kind of sort of like regionalism that's sort of going on within the film that sort of taps into. So it's almost like two strikes against the movie, really. That the minute you sort of get outside the confines of the M25, we're starting to see somewhere that, whilst it's ostensibly England, it could also be the backwoods of America in the way it is kind of shot and filmed. These people aren't quite represented as hillbillies, but we're not going that too far from, that kind of particular horror trope in the way that they are represented. Positive representations. I mean, I know that, I think we're going to come on to talk about Session 9, which is, one of my sort of fave horror movies. But I think, it is rare actually to see this kind of positive representation of working class people, blue collar workers, whatever you want to kind of call them. And I think that this is something that does stretch beyond, even sort of recent times. I don't know why it occurred to me, the famous urban legend, it goes by various names, of Killer in the Backseat or High Beams, which is a story about a woman, and he's either a truck driver or he's a gas attendant, and he's actually trying to help her and save her. But her kind of gut reaction is to be suspicious of him. And we are always, is that because of his social class? And the answer is always yes, even though he's trying to do a good thing, because, of class or prejudice and suspicion. And I think many horror movies, are often informed by these urban legends, which, many, I think, sort of grew up in the 40s and the 50s, and then inform many of the horror movies that we grew up to watch. But yeah, sadly, I think sort of positive representations of sort of working class characters or communities are rare.
Yeah, and I think while the landscape is, I'd like to think, certainly changing historically, and we've sort of touched on it already, working class characters in horror have either been presented as lacking in intelligence or as something to be feared. And I guess in Eden Lake, it's both. So in some cases, it is both. But I wanted to, I guess, build off our discussions about Eden Lake and hoodie horror, and obviously just open this out beyond that as well, and ask about the responsibility when it comes to social messaging, and how that might either exploit or reinforce those negative and damaging stereotypes. So, Caitlyn, what are your thoughts about the social responsibility of the messages in these horror films?
I'm always a little bit reticent to say anything about social messaging in films, because I think films are there for a lot of reasons that people would point to and call films dangerous in ways that they really aren't, in terms of depictions of violence, for example. That's the big debate of films. Do they cause violence? Do they deprave and corrupt, then, to use an old Video Nasty saying? So yeah, I'm kind of reluctant to put too much emphasis on social messaging within a horror film, because I think a lot of people are going to go into a horror film, they already know it's a horror film, so they know that someone's going to be made the villain. It just so happens that with Class, it tends to be that they are always going to be the villain, and that's more of the issue. And I think the answer to that then is variety, and that we need that variety, because then it doesn't sting quite so much. I think when we talk about representation more widely, it's kind of like, if you have lots of different types of representation, the bad ones don't sting so much, because you can point to any other number of heroes or interesting characters rather than just all being villains. I think that's the most important thing, is that variety.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Kat, what about you?
Yeah, I agree. I think horror, in a way, is kind of behind a lot of the other genres. I mean, I was thinking sort of like war films, for example. the working class or uppers seen as more of the hero figure. It always tends to be like the officers, the more educated officers, who are seen as like Weasley or weak, and they're sort of hiding in the back while the working class grunts are out there, you know, winning the war for people. Whereas horror is still very much in the, no, let's not go near. They're the bad people. We don't want to be like, we don't want to be poor. Oh no, none of that. And that, you know, like obviously kitchen sink dramas, again, it tends to be somebody of a lower income whose story we're following, or the underdog overthrowing. But horror just doesn't seem to be that connected with telling those sorts of stories. So I definitely think that there's room for a lot of improvement in that arena, because like Caitlyn said, variety is what we need. You know, it's a spice of life, as they say, and it'd be nice to see it represented a little bit more than, oh look, that, you know, that gas attendant is going to be bad because they're always bad. I think we need to do something to move away from that.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with both of you on that notion of variety, because it's through those different voices that we get understanding of each other, isn't it? Mal, what do you think about this? Have you got anything to add about the idea of responsibility in social messaging?
Yeah, so it's a funny one. I don't want to say this in the way it's going to come out, but I'm going to say it anyway. I think because horror is becoming a bit more trendy now, because people are waking up with horror and like, oh, horror is pretty cool now. Now, we all know it's been great for years and years and years. I think there's a bit more in it when it comes to that messaging, because people are trying to use horror in a way which I suppose is like for those that aren't familiar with it, the new thing, right? Oh, let's use a horror vehicle to get our message across. And there's films out there like Us was a good example, or His House is a good example, where it touches upon class, it touches upon the literal above and below settings, the refugee situation in His House, for example, and it starts talking about things that maybe you wouldn't necessarily expect from a horror film. And then what I think what's happening now is there is this sort of almost, I won't say responsibility, but a message coming out that, you know, horror can have a voice in this. And I think there's films out there that don't necessarily nail it, but I think they are trying to. Even like Parasite, right? There's elements in Parasite as a film where it's a them and us, or above and below thing, and it's having those discussions. And you'd probably pick up that film and watch it and not really expect to see what you see, but when you watch it, it starts having a discussion or thought in your mind, and then that in turn takes that discussion elsewhere. And I think horror has got a lot more potential than probably we give it credit for when it comes to having these discussions, because everyone would go out there and watch, you know, that sort of film. Like even Candyman, right? I'm just not trying to not name drop films here, but even Candyman has an element of, well, there's a relatable element here. And with most films, if you're like we're all working class here, and if you can relate to something in a working class environment and think, I can get on board with that, I can see the message they're trying to convey here, even if it's a small message. And I'll come to probably attack the block a lot later in the podcast, but there's representation that you can aspire to, and I think horror has an opportunity there to really build on, like I said, what now is almost fashionable, shall we say, like the likes of A24 now putting films out because there's a market that they think, oh, we can tap into, but it's always been there. We're just trying to change that narrative now. So I think there is definitely opportunity, but I think there is stuff that exists that we can tap into further as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think horror is an incredible vehicle for exploring just a multitude of issues, because it can do anything. It can be extreme or it can be allegorical. So yeah, I completely concur with you on that point. Belle, did you have anything to add to this discussion?
Yeah, no, like this is a question that like was interesting to me, and it's kind of funny because it's like a recurring question that I have on my ongoing Why Horror series on Fishnets and philosophy, because that's the question that kind of is always on my mind about the whole, you know, are filmmakers responsible for what they're putting out there? And it's something that, you know, I can never land on a correct answer, because I don't think there is a clear answer. I think it's such a nuanced and tricky subject, because like, you know, is the filmmaker responsible for the biases that viewers are bringing to a film? Like, as in, even if a filmmaker puts out the most positive representation of any type of social minority, whether it's working class, race, gender, whatever it is, it could be the most positive representation ever. If someone comes into it with already a negative bias of that type of representation, they're not going to pick up on it as positive. They're already coming at it with the negative. So like, I kind of think, kind of coming back to Caitlyn's point of, if you drill down too much on like, what should we be doing with our social messaging, I think you lose the power of the art form itself. Like, I think ultimately when it comes to representation, whether it is working class, race, we need it all, because that's what representation is. If it's only villains, then that's a problem. If it's only heroes, that's also a problem. Like, you need to have that entire spectrum of you need to see real people, whether, because like in the real world, there are people who do terrible, shitty things, and there are people who do brilliant things. So having that captured, I think, is the kind of what the focus should be on. So like, but I do think kind of spin, and possibly would lead into kind of the other question you were kind of going to have about any positive examples that we can think of. I think spinning off from it, I do think filmmakers, even though they can't control how people will react and what people will take away from a film, they can control the type of characters they depict. So I do think that even if it's not necessarily, how do we talk about social messaging, just stopping leaning into negative stereotypes, or using those stereotypes but subverting them. Like, so for example, when it comes to positive examples of working class, like one of the ones that always comes to my head is Tucker and Dale versus Evil. Like, those two characters are working class, but they're also brilliant. They're humanized, and you're on their side. And like, that's one example. Like, another one that kind of came to mind for me as well, in a slight, not as well done, but similar vein, was Cannibals and Carpet Fitters, like a British horror film, and it kind of did something similar, but not to the same level. But I do think that filmmakers can be clever with how they use those characters. You can say something while leaning into the stereotype but subverting expectations. But ultimately, I want to see it all types of representation.
So, brightening things up a little bit now then, let's talk more about those sort of more grounded and I guess more fully realised depictions in horror, from everything from Alien to Session 9, which we've mentioned briefly. I'll invite anyone now who wants to chip in about their thoughts on how these characters are portrayed, or any other positive examples that you've identified. Anyone who wants to jump in, feel free.
Shall I say something about Session 9, because I kind of mentioned it earlier. I mean, one of the reasons I think I like Session 9, although it's been criticised for being underwritten, there's actually something about the spareness of the narrative that I actually really like, and I think we're given enough information about the characters without being given too much. And it's a film that I like very much, but I think from that kind of position of working class characters, you actually really feel the pressure of the central character played by Peter Mullen, that I won't give any spoilers away for people who haven't seen Session 9. If you haven't, you should. That you can actually really see that, this guy is bought into the capitalist dream of owning his own business and working for himself, but it's just all falling apart. And, I think this is something that he's rarely actually kind of tackled in movies, that, the whole kind of dream of, the working class guy who does it for himself and runs a crew. And he's a responsible boss. He tries to do the best for his crew, but a fantastic central performance by Peter Mullen, and, just a really great film. And, I know that there was sort of like several scenes that were cut from the movie that were going to have one sort of presentation of really what was going on. But I always kind of sort of see this film as, what is it that's causing this central character to fall apart? And we gradually come to realize, what it is and what's happened. But I think for me, just these guys who are all doing this, let's face it, not great job, purely for the money. and they're all feeling the pressure, and each of them has their own particular burdens. And I just think it's a movie that actually is pretty sympathetic in most of the characters that it represents. Even the Hank character, who's shown as very sort of driven by money and literally gold. He's a jazz fan. He likes Yanni, and so we're not just being given these kind of like horrendous, brutish stereotypes of working class characters. So that's why I quite like Session 9.
Is there anyone else who wants to chip in on that question before we move on?
Yeah, I can. I think on the point of positive visualization, I suppose for me, like I mentioned earlier about Attack the Block. For me, I think that's a great way of looking at horror can do good with this type of subject matter. Again, I grew up in South London, so I can resonate a lot with that environment. I knew people like that, to be fair, growing up as well. And for me, watching the film, I've seen it a few times now. There's so much in there that I was nodding along to when what they were saying. Things like the police not believing the kids because of who they are and what they represent. And I remember getting stopped and searched or car pulled over for whatever so many times in my life, and I was like, well, I know what the cops are like in that environment. But there's one line that really resonated with me when the alien first comes and there's all this stuff going on. One of the chaps says to John Boyega, he goes, because I think along the lines of what we aren't killing ourselves fast enough, so they're sending something out of space or worse to that effect to speed up the process, because they know they're in a fight. They know they're in a fight for survival, because that working class environment for them is just they're there. They can't get out of that. And I think Attack the Block, what it does, it flips that political narrative through the film. You see obviously Jodie Whittaker's character kind of afraid, gets mugged, but then funnily enough, they explain the mugging afterwards. Say, actually, we were scared as well. In the film, so the kids were almost like, well, we were afraid of doing it, but we just, how it is. That element comes in, and then the other chap, the posh kid, puts on a ghetto voice to fit in. So there's almost like a positive reaffirmation of being working class in that film. And the best part for me in Attack the Block is towards the end when not only do the kids end up being the heroes and Jodie Whittaker saves them and says, you know what, yeah, they're our neighbours kind of thing, but Moses at the end, John Boyega's character at the end, is hanging off the Union Jack in survival. And I think it's such a poignant picture, because you look at it and think, well, there's so much in that, right? And I won't tell you what I think about it. Watch it for yourself and take it for yourself. But he's hanging on for dear life, hanging on to the Union Jack, survives, whatever he's got to do. Spoilers, sorry for that. But there's no coincidence in that scene, right? I think so there's a lot in Attack the Block that we can take away and think that flips the whole narrative. And I think what it does, right at the end, you look at it and think, well, the police got the wrong people again, because they were looking to feed Jodie Whittaker more and more lines to say, well, was it them? Was it them? And again, like, well, no, hang on, it wasn't them. They actually saved the day. You got the wrong people yet again. So for me, I think that really, amazing film to watch, but also relatable in so many ways politically and so on and so forth.
So I'm going to move into I've got some specific questions for you all now. So Caitlyn, you are the biggest, without a doubt, and I won't have anyone say any different, Ben Wheatley fan that I have ever met. So I really wanted to talk to you and get your thoughts about class, because it certainly feels like that's one of many themes that he's playing with in his work. So what do you think some of the potential messages are about class that he's trying to make in his films? And are there any specific characters that you think you connect with or are depicted really successfully?
I'll take the crown of biggest Ben Wheatley fan. I'm happy to go with that. Yeah, I think Ben Wheatley's treatment of class is really interesting, because obviously Down Terrace focuses on exclusively working class hitmen. And it's interesting to see, because what he does so well is mix genres, and he puts people you wouldn't expect to see in that situation. So you get your horror heist movie, you get your trippy war movie, you get all of these things. So it's always about uprooting people and putting them in a place where they're already sort of out of their comfort zone. You know, you're already seeing that, or there are clashing elements that work like that. And I think what he also does is the sort of battle of class then, and particularly Kill List, it opens with them arguing about 40 grand in 8 months. That's not working class salary. But there's the entire thing is this fear of backsliding, because he's very clearly, Jay in Kill List is very clearly from a working class background. And there's a great determination to not go back there, you know, but they're not talking about day-to-day living within that scene. They're talking about luxuries, they're talking about wine, they're talking about holidays, they're talking about the hot tub. They're all these comforts that he's kind of got used to, and he really doesn't want to go back. And I think that fear of backsliding, but also fear of forgetting who you were, is quite interesting. And I mean, I did mean to touch on at one point the Welsh film Goer, which does that theme incredibly well as well. So Glenda within that film is working class, but she is married an MP and now lives an entirely different life. And there's an entire thread within that film that focuses on her guilt for, you know, what her mom would think about where she is now. You know, there's a great marrying of, within that folk horror tradition, the land, your class, where you came from, where you're going, and what you owe to the land. And I think, to sort of talk it back into Ben Wheatley in those terms, his folk horror afield in England, you have Whitehead, who is an academic, or certainly more academic, being confronted with these characters who are not. You know, they are decidedly more working class within that context. And he's kind of explaining things to them. So it's not great. It is quite regressive, but still it sort of comes as almost a merry band of men, if you like, or a not so merry band of men, who are all trying to find their own identities. I mean, they're all fleeing a war they don't want to be involved in. And I think there's something there's that one unique thread that kind of binds them, that allows them to kind of see each other's viewpoints a little bit more clearly. But yeah, certainly there's a fear of loss and what that means, and loss of comfort and things like that, a lot in Ben Wheatley's work.
Yeah, I love how you talked about how he harnesses like fear and fear of the self, the past self. There's so many riches to dig into there. And we want more essays from you, Caitlyn, on these films. We need more of your musings.
Maybe.
Mike, I guess we've touched on it a little bit already, but as a director writer working within the film industry, I was really curious to ask you about the conversations that might be going on within that world, and how far they are focused on class. Do you see and feel that working class voices are being nurtured in that world? And sorry to throw a third question into the mix. If you can, how do you yourself ensure that you bring that perspective into your own work?
Sure. I mean, if I'm going to be honest, Rebecca, people aren't really having sort of conversations around social class in terms of how sort of people from working class backgrounds can be nurtured, you know. I mean, I think really there's a festival which I'm a big supporter of called Horror on Sea, which some of you may know. And the festival director, Paul Cotgrove, has always nurtured local talent and, you know, specifically sort of working class talent. But, you know, in terms of conversations actually happening, they're not really happening. And, you know, opportunities are still pretty sparse for people from, you know, working class backgrounds to try and get into the industry. And, you know, we've already sort of spoken about that. I mean, in terms of, you know, what am I trying to do about it? I mean, you know, I think it was Belle mentioned earlier that, you know, sometimes you do just sort of see this kind of lazy writing and lazy filmmaking where it is just, you know, working class stereotypes being leaned on again and again, and all of that kind of, I am smoking a fag, when, you know, you just want to turn on these kind of very kind of convenient tropes to kind of signify that this is a sort of, you know, lazy working class person. So I suppose at the inception of anything that I'm working on, I always, you know, think about, you know, representation at the writing stage before we even get on set, so that, you know, if a character does something, there's a reason for it, or, you know, it's part of their character. This is good writing. Lazy writing is just when you just fall back on stereotypes. And, you know, I suppose as a filmmaker, I try and avoid those stereotypes as best I can. And the other thing, I guess, is, you know, within the filmmaking, the indie filmmaking community, you know, we try and help each other. We share each other's stuff. You know, we physically support each other. So, you know, I'll go and act in somebody else's film and they'll act in mine, and it just makes our money go a little further. And, you know, we've already spoken about the fact that if you are from a working class background, it is very difficult to make a living from film. And to that end, I teach 3 days a week in a college. I teach filmmaking. And so what I try and do, both, you know, as an educator and a filmmaker, is when I'm working on my own productions, is bring, you know, students on board and actually kind of give them that entry into the film industry. Albeit it's the budget film industry, because it's my films. But I think that, you know, that's really what I'm trying to do about it. And I think, you know, just trying to support other filmmakers, whether it's buying a t-shirt or retweeting something, you know, this really does make a big difference. And really, you know, I spoke about the fishbowl earlier. This is really the only way, if you are at the bottom, that you're going to break out, because, you know, you aren't going to be able to do it by yourself. And lacking those kind of material resources just means that, you know, you have to sort of, you know, create a community, and then from that, you know, you can kind of sort of punch through a little bit. But yeah, I guess that's kind of what I'd say. And then when I'm on set, try to be as collaborative I can with the talent, and, you know, just ensure things like dialogue and that are as authentic as possible. I mean, Mal mentioned Attack the Block earlier, and I remember reading I think it's Joe Cornish, the writer of that, spent about 6 months at a youth centre in Lewisham to kind of, you know, interviewing people to ensure that, you know, he's got the dialogue right. And I think that that's something else I try and do, that, you know, when, you know, there are representations, you make sure that they are authentic and you avoid stereotypes, but you also work with your talent on set to ensure that you are getting these authentic performances.
Yeah, it's great to hear there's that degree of camaraderie, and it's to hear you say as well, like, how important that is. That's definitely something I see and feel in the horror community myself. And as someone who's a huge fan of your work, who's reviewed your work, I can confirm that it's very authentic, it's very well written, and there's always well thought out intention behind all your filmmaking. So really appreciate what you bring to the industry and to the genre.
Thank you so much.
So Belle, as well as having your incredible podcast, you are also a performer, and I know that you were keen to talk specifically about how class intersects with queerness. So I would love to hear you speak more on that point.
Yeah, no, definitely. Like, you could easily have like an entire podcast series dedicated to this topic. So trying to narrow it down into like the last few minutes we have, I'll do my best. But I think it is something like, and again, like when it comes to any of these type of like your identities and social minorities, like, you know, I think a lot of people forget that so many of them intersect. And it's something that, you know, you were saying as well earlier, Caitlyn, is like when it comes to films, that, you know, class might be an element of a character in a film, but it's not necessarily the focus of the film's narrative. And I think when it comes to, you know, outside of film and just like society in general, there is so much intersection. And I think a lot of people forget how it overlaps. Like, you know, so just kind of the way I was talking about it, like, I'm quite lucky in that, like, you know, in my day-to-day life, I'm a very visibly queer person, and I can be visibly queer at work. And that's like a form of like privilege that I'm aware of, because like that's not the case for a lot of queer people. Like, people who are visibly queer can't find jobs, can't work, or they have to hide their queer identity in order to get work, in order to survive. or alternatively, if they can't get any work, they turn to sex work and other forms of survival work. And I think that overlap of queer identity and working class is something that people need to kind of focus on a lot. And also, there does seem to be this type of social narrative that queerness or queer people are only upper class or are only from the elite parts of society, that there are no queer people in the working class, there are no working class queer people. And because of that weird type of social narrative that kind of seems to exist, it means it's very hard for working class queer people to actually be authentically queer, because they can't find the support in their communities because of some of those biases that are, I don't know where they come from, how they start, but they are there. And it's such a tricky thing to, for someone who has these overlapping of identities, that part of themselves they can't embrace, or they can't acknowledge a part of themselves because another part of themselves says that part is somehow wrong, or again, like, as in, there is that type of narrative. And even though that program is very awful and very problematic, but there was that recurring joke in that Little Britain show about, I'm the only gay in the village, and even the show was the flipping it, saying it was wrong. But there is that belief that there are a lot of people who think when they're in these rural working class communities or working class city communities that there is no one else like them, because there isn't that support there. And it's like, I don't know where exactly my point is going. I could be talking on it for a long time, but I think it's just, when it comes to representation as well, like seeing more working class queer representation in our screens, in our stories, I think is something that's really important, because at the moment, so much of the queer stories that we're getting are upper class people. And also upper class and white. We get very few, queer stories that are people of color. And one kind of last kind of main point on this that I just kind of want to talk about as well is that, when it comes to, say, trans people, like if you're a trans person and you're working class, you may not be able to get access to the actual life-saving hormones or surgeries that you may need to alleviate your dysphoria, because so many of those things are an access thing, a privilege thing. And I think there is that view that trans people are only of a certain class, of a certain race, and it's like, we're everywhere. Queer people are everywhere in every facet of society, and I just kind of wish that it was more acknowledged. And very last point, I think, queer people, working class people, we intersect, we overlap, and also everyone can support each other. Like, the one kind of example that stands out to me, the 2014 film Pride, which tells the story of, like, the Welsh, like, miners' strike from 1984-85, where lesbians and gays support the miners, became a movement in their pride marches to raise money for the striking miners. So that's like, in our kind of capitalist society, and I think this is something that is lost a lot in the narrative, is that, everyone is a worker. Yes, there's varying levels of where people might sit, but ultimately, the 1% of the elite, we're all the workers that are being exploited. And if more people kind of realize that, and realize that we're all on each other's side, we could make things better for everyone. And that's my preaching done.
No, thank you honestly so much, Belle, for bringing that to the table. And I think we all want more access, more visibility. So thank you so much. Kat, you've written for some incredible outlets as well as GHOULS Magazine, but we've spoken before on another GHOULS panel about motherhood in horror. And when I was doing some sort of research and reflecting on representation of the working class in horror, I came across actually quite a lot of parental figures, especially mothers. Caitlyn's already mentioned the Babadook, but other ones are like The Shining, Child's Play, just to name a few. I wanted to ask if you had any specific thoughts on those portrayals and any other examples that you'd like to share.
I think there's a lot of horror films that deal, especially from earlier on in time that deal with single parents, single mothers especially, and they inevitably have to work because their partner has either died or was abusive and they've had to move away, or they're just, you know, there was just a general breakdown in the relationship. And by them working, they are then, I feel, vilified for that. They are seen as bad mothers, as neglectful. In Child's Play, for example, the mother is so focused on, and quite rightly focused on, making sure that her and Andy have a roof over their heads, that she fails to see what's happening at home with him, because, you know, she's got to provide for her child. She can't be everywhere. And I feel that horror, especially in this area, is just, it's very hard to be a mother in horror at all, full stop, as we discussed in the last panel. But I think when it comes to single mothers especially, it's really, really rammed that these women are doing their child a disservice by not being around. And that really doesn't sit well with me. As I mentioned earlier, I am a product of a single parent environment, and, you know, my mum did everything that she could for me. And I do like that there is, I think, a slight shift now. I think a lot of films now tend to be, there's not too many single parents that I can remember off the top of my head. The women are more middle class and they're still having issues looking after their kids. I mean, there's one recent example, The Cellar, where Alicia Cuthbert's child in the film disappears, and she's a big marketing exec, and it was nice to see a more positive example of a working mother still have the same kind of issues as somebody else. But I also kind of want to mention Evil Dead Rise would probably be the most recent example of a single parent family. Just in general, when we meet them, their house, the building that they're in, is about to be demolished in the next few weeks. There's been a recent breakdown in the relationship, and there's just this Ellie, Alyssa Sutherland's character, is trying to hold this family together. And before you know, the Book of the Dead comes into play, you get this really nice representation of this mother who is managing to work and keep an eye on her kids. You know, she's working in the room while her youngest is playing around. Okay, she can't give as much attention as she probably would like to her, but she is present, she is around, she is aware of what is happening with all of her children. She knows, you know, where everybody is, and she's there to provide for them. So I'm hoping that the representation is going to get a little bit better, and we're not going to get too many more child plays. Or The Conjuring 2, you know, that poor mother in The Conjuring 2, she goes through it. And like, even like Ghost Watch and stuff, there's this long history of single mothers being sort of demonized for the fact that they have to work to feed their children. You know, what are they going to do? Not feed their children? They're going to be demonized even more.
Yeah, we can't win, can we?
No, basically, don't be a mother in a horror film and you'll be fine.
So, final question then, it goes to you, Mal. So, as someone who's a working class writer, editor, podcaster in the world of horror, I have found on my journey that there was at times a real lack of working class voices being heard, and for me specifically, trying to push to be heard could be challenging. But I am finding that more and more voices we've talked about technology and access and things, and supporting each other and that camaraderie. So I think, you know, more space is being given, and I fully embrace that, and I hope that continues. But what more do you think that we can do to address, you know, the lack of positive representation, and to encourage and nurture those working class voices and the kind of stories that are being told?
Yeah, it's a tricky one because, like Mike said a little while back, if you're an independent filmmaker, you're preaching to the people that are probably going to support you anyway. So they're already there buying your film movie tickets for whatever festival you're going to and supporting the film and tweeting about it. The problem I think we have on that point is going beyond that, and it's finding new audiences or finding people that wouldn't have experienced that. And I think one thing that's happened recently, beyond podcasts and everything else, is I think there's been a renewed appetite, shall we say, to really get festivals or weekenders or showcasing films basically in cinemas and events and stuff where you wouldn't normally see that. So Mike mentioned Horror on Sea, which represents a fair bit. There's other festivals around the UK that do a lot. Celluloid's another one, and there's a few others. Forbidden Worlds does a representation as well. So of older films or remastered films. They're based in Bristol, I think. And I think what the idea there for me would be for others to seek out these sort of films that probably they wouldn't have seen the first time around. Find out a way of broadening those horizons, because ultimately we're stuck in an environment where you log on to Netflix or Prime or whatever and you watch what they tell you to watch because this is the top 10 today, and it's a curated list. It's not an actual top 10, right? And it's here's what you should watch, so you watch it. But there's so many hidden gems that we don't see that represent working class people in a positive light in horror films and beyond. There's a film that I saw by accident at Fright Fest, which was called Cruel Summer. It was a 10 o'clock in the morning film, and it's about a kid that gets bullied by working class people. He's doing his Duke of Edinburgh award, but it was such a brilliant film that I wouldn't have normally seen. And I think that's probably what we can do more in the horror communities. And it's hard, I get that, because like Caitlyn said earlier, you make the film and then the hardest part is getting it promoted, getting it released, or getting it distributed, or getting someone. But I think getting that message across to sort of say take a chance on horror films. I think we've always said this as horror fans for years and years and years now. I think people don't take a chance on horror, and I think maybe jump on this, I won't say bandwagon because I hate using that term, but jump on the vibe that suddenly horror's cool again when it's always been cool, right? And then use that to really use that voice. And I think that's where I think, because we had a little bit of it in the sort of 90s and late 2000s. We know when Purge came out, it was the working class taking over and basically killing the rich. And those sort of films, like Mike mentioned, People Under the Stairs. Even American Psycho, we all love it, but it's a rich dude who's the bad guy, not a working class person, and he picks on the working class people, that sort of stuff. So I think there are nuances of these representations, but I think it's just seeking them out. And I think it's about we've got to try and win, but I'm not sure how. Like I said, because you generally speak to a captive audience, and you end up speaking to people that are going to attend that festival or that event. But I think there are more and more of those events now across the UK that we can attend. What's it called? The one at Aberystwyth, that festival as well, does a lot of promoting not only new films but older remastered films as well. And I think there are events. So I think this is broadening those horizons for me, and making sure that lack of before it was a lack of I suppose finding these events and festivals and finding these films. Now they're everywhere, and Prime's got a lot of crap on it, but there's some stuff in there that you can really seek out and watch as well. And you end up finding a lot of independent films on there, a lot of films that you wouldn't normally see on Prime. That's a great example of finding some stuff on there as well. So I think that's where I would do, and just take a chance and stuff. It doesn't have to be something that's reviewed well on Rotten Tomatoes. Just take a chance.
Here we go. You heard it from Ghouls. Take a chance. It is nearly Eurovision. Okay.
There you go.
So, as we reach the end of the panel, then I just want to give a huge thank you to all the incredible guests that are here with me: Kat, Caitlyn, Mike, Mal, and Belle, for being so generous with your time and giving your thoughts on such an important topic. I think we could talk much longer, but this has been so amazing to have this discussion that I've wanted to have for a long time, and my hope is that this too now will go towards just opening up those conversations. But I'd like to invite everyone to share where we can find you on socials, and then also please plug any up and coming projects. And finally, I also just want to give everyone the chance to give a shout out to a working class creator of their choice. So you can recommend a writer, podcaster, costume designer, filmmaker, anybody. So Kat, if we start with you.
Yep. So on Letterboxd, Twitter, Instagram, I am at Gizmo Shikari. You'll find links to all of my work. At the minute, there's not necessarily anything to plug. I've got a few podcasts lined up to record, and then it's prepping for festival season. In terms of a shout out, I feel one of the things it's kind of, unless you know the person, it's kind of hard to know who is working class and who isn't working class, because, I think a lot of us who are on this panel now, we may have started out with working class backgrounds, but we have gone sort of slightly higher up that ladder to, I know myself, I went to university, I was the first in my family. So it's kind of hard to necessarily know anybody. So I don't necessarily want to shout out anybody and then be like, actually, they went to Eton and whatever. But I will say that one film that I enjoyed that was to do with class was by a director called Will Jewell, and it's called Concrete Plans. It's set in Wales, and it's about some contractors who get called in by this rich guy to do some work, and he isn't going to pay them, and they find themselves in a very tricky situation of what do they do with this guy now that they know he's not going to pay. And there's just this one lovely character, God bless him, he's the foreman of the group, and he's just the loveliest guy there, but everybody around him is just awful. And I feel so sorry for the positive representation of a hardworking working class guy. He's your guy. So I would urge people to go and watch Concrete Plans.
Thank you so much. And Caitlyn, what about you? And if anyone's unsure of giving a shout out, you can recommend a film, a book, a resource.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter under @Sheepless, and that's got a link tree on there to everything else as well, and Instagram as @ScaredSheeplessBlog. In terms of a shout out, it's a more general thing really, and I think it's about sort of giving sites like Ghouls and even smaller sites a bit of a chance, because you never know whose voice might capture you. Again, it's that thing about assuming like class status and everything like that, but you do tend to find, I think, on smaller sites, spaces where people are just getting started, or maybe can only do it part-time because of where they are in terms of work. So definitely check those sites, those collaborative pieces where you're going to find people who are more likely to speak for you.
Great. Mike, what about you?
Oh, I've got a long list.
Settle in, everybody.
Yeah, I'm a filmmaker, which basically means I'm a part huckster as well. So ultimately, I'm currently working on my second feature film, Burnt Flowers, which I'm hoping to have released in 2024. In addition to that, you can find me on social media, either under Michael Fausti or @Fausti Films. My website is faustifilms.com. You can go and purchase a t-shirt or a DVD. If you're a young person who likes watching your movies on your phone, I am on Amazon Prime. As Mal said, there's a lot of crap on Amazon Prime, but I'm also on there. I'm on Amazon Prime, my film Exit. I'm also on Tubi, if you're in the US or you got a VPN. In addition to that, who do I want to give a shout out to? As I'm a filmmaker, I also push the boundaries. So rather than one person, I'm going to give a shout out to 3 people. My cinematographer is a guy called Kamal Yildirim, who's also a filmmaker himself, and he's made 2 excellent films recently, one called Wastelands, another one called The Haunting of Lady Jane. So check those out. I spoke earlier about sort of collaborating and helping other filmmakers, and this filmmaker called Andrew Elias, who's recently made a film called Tales from the Great War, which I have a very small role in to help him out. And that's also on Amazon Prime, so go and give that a watch. And finally, big shout out to Paul Cockgrove, Festival Director of Horror on Sea. And if you're a filmmaker, he has just opened his submissions window for the festival for 2024, and it's free, which is a big difference to a lot of other film festivals who want to take 50 quid off of you to not watch your film and just have you submit it. So if you're a working class filmmaker, submit the Horror on Sea. It won't cost you a penny.
There we go. Zoe and I are going to make a film now. Get ready. Belle, how about you?
Yeah, so my podcast is Fishnets and Philosophy, wherever you get podcasts. I've got my website, which is fishnetsandphilosophy.com. So you can kind of go there to kind of find everything else. I'm on social media, Mix, Bell, Morrigan, across the board. That's where I am everywhere to make it easy so you can try and find me. Also on certain not safe for work sites, if you like into that stuff, you can find me there too. And then when it comes to shout outs, this like again, it's like one of those tricky ones, like kind of like you both and Caitlyn and Kat were saying, like you don't really know who is working class, but also as well, it's what's the parameters for what you define as working class? Because again, coming back to it, everyone is a worker, but unfortunately the elites have made us war against each other by saying no, we're different, and it's like, well, no, we should all band together. But when it comes to a working class creator, well, I would shout out you, Rebecca, because you're one of the best voices from that identity, from that community. And I just think more people should support your work. And yeah, that would be my little shout out.
I didn't pay Belle, just for reference. Thank you so much. And Mal, let's finish with you.
Yeah. As far as socials go, I'm Mal Jutley pretty much everywhere. So Insta, Twitter, and Letterboxd and that. I don't have a podcast or anything. I write an occasional mental health blog. There's a link on it on Twitter as well if you want to read that. I don't, like I said, I get involved in the odd podcast here and there. So I haven't got anything project-wise running. My main thing is being at festivals, really. So you probably see me at a random festival, no doubt, or film events. As far as I suppose shout-outs go, again, I sort of probably did a bit of it in my last question answer, where there are lots of independent festivals, events, and stuff you can go to. I would shout that out, but I would, and this is not necessarily related to horror, but in general, just keep an eye out on sort of I'd always say up and coming British filmmakers. There's so many, the industry's really, really booming right now, and there's so many filmmakers, and I couldn't list them all here, but there's always someone who's making a film who just, again, take a chance on them. Like I said before, I'm not trying to, I'll be singing the ABBA song soon, but so I will say, just pick up on upcoming filmmakers, and there's always Mike's film Exit is great. I've got the DVD of it. I'll give Mike a plug. And do what there are filmmakers out there that you probably don't even realize that are making amazing films, and you just haven't had the chance to watch it yet. So that's my shout out, really.
Great. Well, thanks to everyone for watching, whether live or later on playback. We've got so much more content over on our website, goersmagazine.com, where you can find editorials, reviews, and our podcast. You can also get access to exclusive content each month by becoming a Ghouls Gang member. For those watching, we've got a special offer for you to get your first month free by using the code WORKINGGHOULS. That's all capitals, all one word. And details, I believe, are shooting across the bottom of the screen as I speak. We've got loads of backlog episodes of our podcasts, including Zoe and I, chatting about extreme films, eek, like Necromantic, and our most recent episode on Picnic at Hanging Rock. I'm sure you can guess who picked which of those. We also have lists, editorials, and so much more from our wonderful, wonderful team. So please support the Ghouls if you can. Join our Ghouls Gang and help us to keep creating quality content. We really appreciate the support that you do show us. So thank you so much. That helps to keep us alive. And who wouldn't want that? Finally, I've been your host, Rebecca. You can find me in my work on Twitter and Instagram at Pendle Pumpkin. And I also have a cheeky little plug for my new podcast, Talking Hitchcock, where I explore the world and the work of his films. If that tickles your fancy, you can find and follow that on hitch_pod or visit the link trees in my socials and they'll take you to the pod. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm off to watch, was it Cannibals and Carpet Fitters? Yeah, I think. Yeah.
Cannibals
So-
and carpet fit.
Cannibals and Carpet. We're having a watch party now. So yeah, thanks for joining us, everybody. We will see you soon, and remember, keep it ghoulish.